Hello and welcome to Trails Worth Hiking, the show that brings you some of the most interesting backpacking and trekking routes in the world. I'm your host, Jeremy Pendry. In the first part of the show, we bring you the story and history of a trail. Then we tell you what it's like to hike the trail and how you can do it. On this episode, we go to an entirely new environment and type of terrain, where we'll hike almost 150 miles in a remote environment where water is cached along the way for hikers. We'll be hiking through beautiful, open, rolling prairie grasslands of the Great Plains of the United States and traverse the ups and downs of steep but shallow sedimentary canyons, or Badlands as they're known in this region. We'll also have to keep our eyes out for wild bison as we hike the Maah Trail in the Badlands of North Dakota. Hello and welcome to the show, everyone. I'd like to start by reminding you of our Trails Worth Hiking first ever backpacking meetup happening next month in March, on March 22nd and 23rd at Point Reyes National Seashore in Northern California. Most of the spots are taken, but there are a few spots left. So if you'd like to come and join me and your fellow listeners and some former guests on the show for a night of backpacking and hanging out, I would love to have you. So reach out to me through a direct message on Instagram at Trails Worth Hiking Podcast or through the email account trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. If you'd like to come, again, only just a few spots left. So last chance if you'd like to come on the Trails Worth Hiking backpacking meetup next month. One of the things that I'll have for the meetup is some outdoor herbivore products to share with those who are there, and maybe even some giveaways. As a reminder, Outdoor Herbivore is our sponsor. Outdoor Herbivore makes delicious vegetarian and vegan backpacking meals, though as I always say, you don't need to be a vegetarian or a vegan to really enjoy these meals. They have lots of calories for a hungry hiker, they use quality ingredients, and they are packaged in convenient boil-in-a-bag packaging so that they're easy to take on the trail. So why not give Outdoor Herbivore a try? Outdoor Herbivore ships worldwide. They have lots of options to choose from on their website. You can see it all there, outdoorherbivore.com. And I also want to announce that we're going to be doing an Outdoor Herbivore giveaway, not just during the Trails Worth Hiking backpacking meetup, but also through the Instagram account, where I'll have a trivia question relating to the show through an Instagram post. And the first person to respond correctly will get a gift certificate for Outdoor Herbivore. We'll see how that goes, but there's a chance for you to try their delicious backpacking meals without paying anything. So keep an eye out for that shortly. Again, Outdoor Herbivore at outdoorherbivore.com. I also wanted to mention that listener David Poirier, who I've mentioned before on the show, who's done a few of the hikes that we've covered on the show, and he's been on our Walking the Walk segment before. He put together a really detailed video of his trip on the Zion Traverse from episode 26 that he posted on his YouTube account, Dave en Rando. In some of his videos, he does them in French. Dave is from Montreal, Quebec in Canada, but on this one it is in English. So you can follow along easily, even if you do not speak French. So check that out. I'll put a link in the show notes to David Poirier's video of his trek on the Zion Traverse. On the show today, our guest is listener Lafe Wessel. Lafe hiked the Maah Trail with his wife, Faith, last summer. I have a few reasons for wanting to do this episode. One is that it's a very unique part of the country, the Great Plains and the Badlands of North Dakota, and it's very different from any environment we've covered previously on the show. So I think that'll be cool for you to hear about a hike that's just entirely different from anything we've done. But also, I did take a trip as a kid with my family, a long driving trip where we drove from California all the way to Minnesota when I was a kid. And I remember going through the Badlands of South Dakota and Badlands National Park and Mount Rushmore. I don't think we made it to North Dakota on my trip when I was a kid, but I did get to see this environment in this area, and it really is unique and really beautiful. So hearing about this trail really inspired me to think about that trip from my childhood. So I'm glad that Lafe is able to share his experience with us on this trail, which I had not heard about before he brought it to my attention, which is also another reason that I wanted to cover it. It's really cool to cover trails that I didn't even know existed, and in a state where you might not otherwise have opportunities to do long-distance backpacking, but for this fabulous trail, the Maah Trail. So let's talk about the area where this hike is. The Great Plains are a massive flatland east of the Rocky Mountains. They consist of prairie, steppe, and grassland. This is in the central United States and parts of Canada. The Great Plains include North and South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, also Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming east of the Rocky Mountains, and parts of a number of other states. This is a 500-mile space east and west, so about 800 kilometers running west to east, and about 2,000 miles or 3,200 kilometers running north to south. One of the more interesting characteristics of parts of the Great Plains, particularly in the Dakotas, is the Badlands environment. The Badlands are a soft, sedimentary soil and clay-rich soil that has eroded and has really steep slopes and no vegetation. And so it forms a kind of a series of ravines or gullies, and those can have really interesting characteristics in them and around them, such as buttes and the towers of sedimentary rock called hoodoos. And so these formations, these canyons, these gullies, can be sort of like a knife slash across the plains, and they're formed by water erosion. The Badlands are an area of high drainage density from a geological perspective, which means that there are more rivers and streams moving water more quickly than you would expect. The phrase Badland is a direct translation of a French phrase, les mauvaises terres, which itself was taken from a Lakota phrase describing the type of area. So essentially, we took the French phrase and directly translated it into English and called it Badlands. One of the things that many of you will know about the Great Plains is this is the home of America's bison. The bison are the heaviest and longest from front to back living land animal in North America. They're not the tallest. A moose can actually be taller than a bison. There are two different species of bison. There's the plains bison and the wood bison. The plains bison are a bit smaller than wood bison. Among bison, males are much bigger than females. Bison are herbivores. They graze on grass and sedges. And interestingly, their closest living relative is actually the yak of Asia, which tells you how the bison got to North America, crossing over from Asia. They've only been in North America for 135 to 195,000 years. So originally not from North America, but made that journey from Asia to North America the same way that people eventually did, crossing the land bridge, I would imagine, over what is now the Bering Strait. By the late 18th century, there were 60 million bison in what is now Canada, the United States, and even northern Mexico. But by 1889, they were down to just 541 animals. And at their lowest point, it's estimated that there were fewer than 100 bison alive. Commercial hunting and slaughter and bovine diseases killed innumerable bison. They were killed by hunters for several different reasons. European settlers wanted their skins and tongues. Furs and skins had commercial value. And even some native tribes, once they learned of this, got into hunting for that reason rather than for traditional uses. In other words, they were hunting them to take the furs and skins and sell them to Europeans. When the railroads were being built, the workers were fed bison, so it was a ready food source for railroad workers. The famous Buffalo Bill Cody was actually hired by Kansas Pacific Railroad to hunt bison. So that's how he got famous as a bison hunter, which was as someone who was providing meat for the railroad to provide to its workers. And then, of course, there was government hunting that was done to force natives off their land. So it was essentially a way to deprive natives of their traditional food source. Today, though, the bison have made a big comeback. There are more than 30,000 today that are wild in national parks and preserves. but about 500,000 of them total that are alive. The vast majority of them, though, are in commercial herds. They can be raised for commercial purposes in the same way that cattle are. They're used for their meat, their hide, their wool, and dairy. Speaking of cattle, in fact, the American bison is genetically so close to cattle that they can interbreed with them. DNA testing has shown that a fair amount of hybridization has occurred, and many have some cattle DNA in them. Today, they are the official national mammal of the United States. If you encounter a bison, give them some serious space. Between 1980 and 1999, 3 times the number of people were hurt by bison in national parks than by bears. So by far a more dangerous threat to humans than bears are. That is one thing that you have an opportunity to see on the Maah Trail. Let's talk about the human history of habitation in this area. It goes back thousands of years, but let's focus on the last 1,000 years. The Mandans have been in the area since the 11th century. A few hundred years later, the Hidatsa came to the area. They're a Siouan people related to the Crow. Later, other Siouan peoples came to the area, including the Lakota Sioux, the Santee, and the Yanktonai. More recently, Europeans have come to what is now North Dakota. Let's talk a little bit about the North Dakota area specifically and not the Great Plains in a larger sense. North Dakota is in the northern Great Plains. It's named after the Dakota Sioux. It's a very sparsely populated state, as the 4th least population of the United States. In the 1730s, there were French-Canadian fur traders in the area. In 1762, it became part of Spanish Louisiana. If it sounds a long way from Louisiana, it is, but if you look on a map, the way that territory was set up, it went all the way up the middle of the United States. That lasted until 1800, when Louisiana, which had been founded by the French, went back to the French from the Spanish. But shortly thereafter, there was the Louisiana Purchase, where this area became part of the United States. From 1861 to 1889, there was the Dakota Territory, so it wasn't yet a state. And in 1889, it was split into North and South Dakota when the states were created. There were very few Europeans in the area until the late 19th century when the railroads opened up the area. At the time, North Dakota was more sparsely populated than South Dakota. It was more wild. It was considered a more disreputable group of folks. There were lots of conflicts with the natives. It had sort of a rough-and-tumble reputation, and to be honest, that's still the case in some respects. In our current century, North Dakota has become a bit of a rough-and-tumble place again. In 2006, there was a big oil boom that happened throughout the state and lasted until about 2014. That resulted from fracking technology opening up areas for oil drilling that hadn't been previously profitable to drill in. This brought lots of money to the state in a short period of time. North Dakota at this time had the lowest unemployment rate in the United States. So during the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, when most of the country was really suffering in employment, there was a huge boom in employment in North Dakota. The boom created 2,000 millionaires a year for several years. By 2013, the state had a $1 billion budget surplus. But as you can imagine, with an oil boom, this also brought environmental problems and increased crime in some areas. Though now the number of oil rigs has fallen dramatically, and although they're still drilling in North Dakota, the boom period seems to be over. The Maah Trail goes through some national federal property that's protected. It goes through the Little Missouri National Grassland, which is more than 1 million acres, so more than 400,000 hectares. This is the largest grassland in the United States. It's part of the Dakota Prairie Grasslands, a national forest unit, which is managed like a national forest, not like a national park. So if you've listened to the show for a while, you might know the difference there that I've described before. Something that's managed like a national forest, in contrast to a national park, is open to potentially hunting or grazing or mineral extraction and more broad types of recreation. These are types of activities that, other than recreation, you can't do in a national park, but you can do in a national forest with the right permitting. So that's how the grasslands are managed. These grasslands are mixed prairie grass and badlands, and the Little Missouri River runs through the middle of it. Within the grasslands is Theodore Roosevelt National Park. So we have a broader area managed like a national forest with a smaller area within it that is a national park. The national park has more than 70,000 acres and does include the Little Missouri River that runs through it. It's in 3 separate sections that together make up the national park. Just to go through some of the animals you could find in the park, in addition to bison, there's also coyotes and cougars and wild Mustang horses, badgers, elk, bighorn sheep, white-tailed deer, mule deer, pronghorn antelope, prairie dogs, and hundreds of species of birds, including golden eagles, grouse, and wild turkeys. The bison, elk, and bighorn sheep were all reintroduced, and thus, although they were native to the area, died out in the area and were brought back in later. It's interesting that the park is named after Theodore Roosevelt, a former president of the United States. Let me quote from the National Park website about Theodore Roosevelt. Quote, "When Theodore Roosevelt came to Dakota Territory to hunt bison in 1883, he was a skinny, young, spectacled dude from New York. He could not have imagined how his adventure in this remote and unfamiliar place would forever alter the course of the nation. The rugged landscape and strenuous life that TR experienced here would help shape a conservation policy that we still benefit from today." End quote. So this park is actually the only national park in the United States named after a single person. As the quote said, Roosevelt first came to North Dakota in 1883 to hunt bison. He got his bison, but he also got a lot more than that. He bought a ranch and later bought a second ranch. The second ranch, Elkhorn Ranch near Medora, North Dakota, is now part of the park. How Roosevelt ended up spending a lot of time in North Dakota is actually a very tragic story. In 1884, on Valentine's Day, both his young wife and his mother died on the same day in the same house in New York. His mother had been ill with a severe cold, or at least that's what they thought it was, but it turned out to have been typhoid fever. And his wife, Alice, who had just given birth to their daughter 2 days earlier, also died. She had had what's called Bright's disease, which is a kidney ailment that had been weakening her for quite a while, and she just wasn't able to recover from giving birth while having that ailment. Roosevelt's mother was 49 at the time. His wife, Alice, was only 22 years old. And Theodore Roosevelt at the time was only 25. After that really horrible, tragic day, he said, "The light had gone out of my life." At the time, he was a state senator in New York, just at the beginning of a promising political career. And he walked away from that political career and went to North Dakota essentially to grieve, and spent quite a bit of time there before returning to politics back on the East Coast. Moving ahead a couple of decades, at age 42, Roosevelt was vice president to President McKinley when President McKinley was assassinated. And at age 42, Roosevelt became the youngest American president. As the National Park quote mentions, he left an impressive legacy to conservation. So I'll go through a few of the things he did. He created the U.S. Forest Service. He created 150 national forests. He signed laws that created 5 national parks. He also created 18 national monuments after signing the 1906 Antiquities Act. And that's what allows a president to create a national monument, which is similar to a national park, except for the fact that it can actually be revoked because it's not created by law, it's created by presidential decree. So it's sort of a first step toward getting to a national park, or at least that's the way it seems to work. And then if Congress passes an act later, the national monument can become a national park. But Roosevelt started that by passing the 1906 Antiquities Act that allows presidents to create national monuments. He created the National Wildlife Refuge System in 1903. He created 55 federal bird reserves and the first 4 national game preserves. In total, Roosevelt protected 230 million acres. One of the things I think is interesting about the Roosevelt story and conservation is, again, the tension between power, money, extractive behavior, and conservation, which we've talked about also on prior episodes. So if you think about it, we're talking about a time when the bison was close to extinction, and Roosevelt came out to the Dakotas to shoot one and kill one. So that's maybe not something we think a great conservationist would do. But his love for the land did lead to him advocating for conservation policies and all of the accomplishments I just listed, which have had an enormous impact on conservation in the United States. And ultimately, we have a national park named in his honor. As I mentioned, there are 3 separate units that make up the national park, and they were created in the 1930s and 40s. In 1948, it became a national memorial park in honor of Roosevelt. And if you're wondering what is a national memorial park, you are right to wonder. It was the only memorial park ever created by the United States. But in 1978, it was renamed as a national park, as it is today. Let's talk about the Maah Trail itself. In 1998, the ribbon was cut after 30 years of planning for the trail. The trail route crosses lands used for native hunting and trading, land of the Mandan, Hidatsu, Arikara, and Lakota Sioux. It also crosses land where America's frontier army spent a lot of time. And it even, as I mentioned, crosses land that was used by Teddy Roosevelt himself when he was in the area. In 2016, a section was added to the trail to bring it to its current distance of 144 total miles. The name Maah Trail, if you're wondering, comes from the Mandan Hidatsa language and means grandfather or long-lasting. I guess it's interesting that they use the same word for both of those concepts, which I guess makes sense. The trail symbol is a turtle, which is a symbol of the Lakota Sioux tribe. And to the Lakota, the turtle symbolizes patience, loyalty, determination, steadfastness, long life, and fortitude. The turtle is emblazoned on the route marker posts throughout the trail. And the trail is administered by the Maah Trail Association, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing and maintaining the trail through voluntary and public involvement and in cooperation with the United States Forest Service. So with that background, let's listen to my conversation with Lafe Wessel about his hike on the Maah Trail. Lafe Wessel, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So, Lafe, we're going to talk today about the Maah Trail in North Dakota, but I'm curious to learn how you actually got to North Dakota and learned about this trail. And one of the things I noticed is that you have a blog about you and your wife, Faith, traveling around in your Honda Odyssey, which I think is super cool. My wife and I had a Honda Odyssey for a long time when our kids were young. So tell me about that and how it came about that you actually learned about this trail.
Yeah, so a year ago, I was on a trip to the Black Hills, and I had intended to go to Jewel Cave, but I forgot to get a reservation, and I was like, well, we're going to need to do something else with my extra day here. And I was all alone, so I decided to drive the extra 4 hours up to North Dakota to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And while I was there, I noticed signs all over the place for the Maah Trail. And once I got back home, I was like, I need to look this place up, learn more about it. And I did a little bit of research, found it's a long distance trail up there, and I thought the area was beautiful. So I kind of put it on my, relatively far down my bucket list, but definitely on it. So when my wife and I started living in a van for this past summer in 2024, we had the opportunity to go do that trail. We both love backpacking, and we haven't ever done a long distance trail. And I thought this would be a really, really good start through hiking or long distance backpacking. So we decided to do it, and that's how we ended up getting there.
Okay, I have 2 questions. The first one is about the van life stuff. How has that been going, or how did that go for this? Was it just for the summer, or are you still doing it?
Pretty much just for the summer. We've kind of wound it down, and I've been visiting family. We started at the beginning of June and then did it all summer long, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It's so much fun. It's very, very enjoyable to live a much more carefree life. So, we wake up somewhere and we go see a few things, drive a few hours, and then, it starts getting dark and we're like, well, time to find a spot to sleep. So we just look around and find something. There's a few apps that we've used, but it's generally everyone is welcoming everywhere, and you can find somewhere safe and quiet and beautiful to sleep.
So tell everyone what your blog is. So if they want to check it out, they can. And I'll put a link in the show notes as well. But what's the name of the blog?
It's lafeandfaithsodyssey.com. So we got a Honda Odyssey, and that's what we're living out of, and we renovated it and whatnot. And it seemed like a pretty punny name, you could say.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So my second question was, why did the Daah Trail seem like the perfect thing to do for your first long distance hike? I think a lot of people would pick some sort of like well-known, iconic, the John Muir Trail or, something like that, or something part of the AT or something like that. Not a lot of people probably know about the Daah Trail.
Sure.
And that's what so intrigued me, is that it's really cool to hear that there is a long distance trail in North Dakota. Why did you think that would be a good first long distance hike?
So there's a variety of reasons. First of all, I think the area is beautiful. It's just gorgeous. I love the Badlands scenery with the rolling hills, the grasses, the river, the Little Missouri River there, and the forests. You do about 18,000 feet of ascent for the whole 150 miles, which works out to be really not all that much. The entire trail is between 2,000 and 3,000 feet of elevation. So you do get a few steep ascents and descents here and there, but for the most part, it's quite flat. So we weren't going to be killing ourselves with ascent every day. And there aren't very many services on the trail in terms of being able to like have food delivered to you or lots of towns or anything. It's quite remote. So you have to do preparation work beforehand. You have to, unless you're doing it supported, you need to utilize the water boxes that the Daah Trail Association has put along the trail to actually have water. There's not very much water in the region. It's quite dry. So I feel like it gave us a great taste of all of the aspects of a long distance trail without being too extreme in the, I guess, physical exertion. Still get a lot of distance. Yeah.
That makes sense that it's, these kind of rolling grasslands, but I don't think they're probably not easy to hike, even though the total ascent and descent may be less than in the mountains. It still looks like some challenging terrain, even if it's not huge ups and downs.
Yes.
So in preparing for doing this trail, what was the best way to go about that? I mean, I know the Daah Trail Association has a website that seems pretty helpful. Was that the main resource?
Yep.
Or are there other resources out there that you focused on as well?
That was the primary one. I did use my Gaia.com, Gaia. I use that as a trail app. So putting points on there and preparing that was definitely helpful. But otherwise, their website was far and away the most helpful resource that I found. There's really not much information out there on it. You can go to U.S. Forest Service website and National Park Service website, but they have fairly limited information. So I would definitely recommend the mdhta.com as the site to go to and what I primarily used.
Okay. Let's talk through some of the logistics. You mentioned it's 144 miles, and I know that you said also 150, and I think that's because there are probably some places where you're going to add a few miles going off trail and then back on trail to get to either campgrounds or maybe a resupply or something like that. But talk me through generally about the distance and the time. How much time did it take you? And is that amount of time a time that you would recommend to others, or would you recommend a slower or faster pace than you and Faith did?
Yep. When I went back and looked, we did 152 miles in 9 days. So the trail itself is 144 miles long. But if you go into Medora, the only town along the route, then you're going to add 3 miles, 1.5 off the trail, 1.5 back. And a lot of the campgrounds that are along the trail are about roughly a quarter mile to a mile off the trail. A few of them are about 4 to 5 miles off the trail. Time-wise, we spent 9 days, so 8 nights, 9 days hiking the trail. It was a pretty good pace, I would say. We went about 15 to 20 miles on the full days, and then the end days on either end, we did, I think, about 12 or 13 miles of hiking. I think that was a pretty good pace. At least personally, after I get about 16, 18 miles, my feet start to hurt just from walking. It wasn't, oh, I'm tired because I've hiked up and down so much. It was mostly my feet just hurt from trotting along for so many miles, which, each person's going to be different in that regard. But I would say we did it in a pretty good pace. I wouldn't want to go much faster than that. And I think you could go a little bit slower if you wanted to, but I don't know that you would gain a whole lot from it.
And is Medora placed along the trail in a convenient location for a resupply?
Yeah, so it's placed about mile marker 54, if I remember right. So it's a little over a third of the way. We hiked the trail from south to north, which I think is the way that people tend to do it. The mile markers start at 0 at the southern part, which is pretty much the only piece of evidence I have for that. But it gives you a good opportunity to have a point to bail out at if things aren't going well. But otherwise, I would probably say you want to use one of the water boxes as a resupply or do it assisted. With our resupply box, we just had one with food and water in it, one with just food, and that one we had at the water box at mile 77. So technically, we're not supposed to use it in that way. It's only supposed to be intended for water, but as long as you're packing your trash out, I don't think it's a big deal at all.
Okay, so that's helpful to know that you can, maybe not supposed to do it this way, but you can use the water boxes as a way to find a place to do a resupply that's more halfway-ish than Medora is if you wanted to do it that way.
Yep.
And does Medora have like a full service grocery store or things where you could buy additional food if you wanted to, or?
Yep, definitely. There's probably a few thousand people in the town.
Okay.
It's not very large, but it is the national park, the Theodore Roosevelt National Park gateway town.
Okay.
So you're going to get a lot of touristy stuff there. And so there's definitely services for resupplying there if you want to.
Okay. Now you mentioned the water boxes a few times. Talk me through that. I mean, it sounds like essentially there's just not that much water available naturally along this route. And so there are places where water is set up for hikers. Is that basically how it works?
Correct. So the Little Missouri River is the only main source of water, and there are some streams that you'll come across that go into it. But because the ground is if you've been to the Badlands, it's very silty. It's bentonite clay. So your water is so chock full of sediment that if you use any filter on it, you're just going to destroy it immediately. And it's not going to work for the rest of your trip. So the main way to have water is to utilize the water boxes. So they're big, about a meter cubed bear-proof containers, which there are no bears in the area, but they're bear-proof nonetheless. Along the trail, I think I'd have to look, but there's 8 or 10 water boxes along the trail, and you pretty much just open it up, toss your water in there, and come back for it at another point. We checked every water box that we walked by, even though a lot of them we didn't put water in beforehand, and almost every single one of them had water in them. So if you do get in a tricky spot, you'll probably be okay. I can't recommend relying upon it, but if it's a life and death situation, you're probably going to be able to utilize what someone else has left for you or for people behind them on the trail. Okay,
so that's helpful to know that you're supposed to cache your own water. So go ahead and put the water in the different water boxes before you start your hike. But it sounds like, and I've seen this before, where there's water caches, for example, on desert hikes, where you often will get to a spot and there'll be a lot of half full gallons or even full gallons that people didn't need and left there. So you might be lucky enough to find it, but you wouldn't want to rely on that. But is another avenue to get water to go to some of the campgrounds and they have water sources at those locations?
Yes. So from Memorial Day to November 1st, per the U.S. Forest Service site, the water is turned on, which you could say, quote unquote, turned on, because there's still hand pumps, and they are hand pumps. It's not like some campgrounds where you just lift the handle and then water eventually comes out. You have to pump it yourself. So be prepared to get an arm workout in getting the water out, and then also be prepared to filter the water. I am sure it's potable and it's clean and it's safe. However, it does have a bit of a sulfury smell. So I would just recommend filtering it afterwards. And, it's nice, clean. It doesn't have that smell anymore. But yeah, so those campgrounds, the ones that are along the trail, all have water to my knowledge.
Okay. I saw that you also mentioned, in addition to the food and water situation, that one of your favorite things that you consumed along the trail was Tylenol, which I thought was hilarious, because that is, I don't know if you've heard my recent Colorado Trail episode yet, but I haven't yet. I talked about how much I had to rely on anti-inflammatories for a hike of that distance. And so I'm familiar with the problem, but I thought that was funny. But it is a good point that it can make a huge difference to, even if you're not wanting to take that all the time, if you're really hurting, it's a good thing to have with you. Yeah.
My wife and I, we got into Medora, the town, on day 4, I believe, right in the morning, and we were beat. We had just done a long day, a 20-mile day on day 3, and my wife, her boots that she started the trail with were not agreeing with her toes, so she switched to her sandals and actually did the entire hike, aside from about 10 miles probably, in her sandals. So
okay,
which are, not really meant for long distance hiking. So she had quite a few blisters. I had started to develop some, and we were quite beat. So to be quite honest, we were about ready to quit, but we got into town. We had some ice cream. We got a bottle of Tylenol and popped one, and it's like there's a whole new world. And so we decided to press on.
You could have done a 0 day. Like you could have just spent 2 nights in town potentially. I don't know if that would have been too expensive, but like that's another thing. If you're really hurting, you can just take a day off. Like that's always an option.
Yes. Yeah. We definitely could have done that. And Medora has plenty of options for that. I mean, there's hotels there. So if you're looking to camp near Medora, there is the Sully Creek State Park campground about 6 miles south of Medora on the trail.
Okay.
The trail goes right through the campground. And since it's a state park, it actually has showers, which was super nice. And we took advantage of those. It was the only shower that we got along the trail. But it felt really great. And there's plenty of campsites there if you want to stay there.
So what was the situation for navigation? It sounds like there's some decent signage on the trail, but did you so tell me about that, but also I want to know if you used your Gaia app or if you use maps or what other navigation tools you used.
Yeah, so the trail is probably the best marked trail I have ever walked.
Okay.
Not only is it well trodden, there's really good tread, especially for the southern half. It gets a little bit worse towards the northern half just because it's a little more remote and fewer people do it. But the signage is really great. There's 4x4 posts, which are probably 6 to 8 feet tall, embedded in the ground, at least within visual range. So you can always see one or two of them. And they have these nice little turtle signs on them. So you always know you're on the Maah trail. As for apps, I used the Gaia app that I mentioned earlier, and I relied on that not all that much because the signage was really good. I did open it up quite a bit just to check, the mileage. Like, okay, are we still going to be able to hit our targets for the day? Are we falling behind? Are we, have we gotten ahead? Stuff like that. But I wouldn't say it's necessary. There are a few detours on the trail that you should be looking out for. They essentially take the posts and move them, but the official site, the Maah site, doesn't have those detours on the site. You just kind of run into them. And if you're not paying attention, you will end up on the closed trail. The 3 times that we encountered detours, 2 of them we went through the closed area. One of them was because there was no alternative. There's essentially a ravine there and you have to get across it. And the sign's just like, oh, you need to turn back because it's closed here. Well, that wasn't really an option. So we just went around the ravine, which wasn't terrible to do. There's just some brush there, but you're able to kind of walk behind the washed out area. Another one, there were a couple sticks across it and across the trail. And we decided to take the quote unquote closed trail. It was still in really good shape. People clearly still used it and there wasn't any washouts or anything. I don't know why they closed it, but we went that way. And then one of the ones we did follow the detour and it added, I think, 1.5 miles to 2 miles. But if you're not paying attention, you will probably end up on the detour. And then if you're watching an app or something like that, it's going to show you being off in the middle of nothing, which would probably be very confusing.
Yeah, that can happen when there's closures. That's a good point to look out for that and to pay attention. I guess you could probably look on the Maah Trail Association website beforehand to figure out closures.
I think I saw one of them on there when I went back and looked, but a couple of them were not on there.
All right.
When I looked originally. So
okay, so
just keep your eyes peeled.
Yeah, okay. One thing you mentioned a few minutes ago is that the northern end is remote, and that made me think about how did you set up the logistics of transportation? I mean, after you've dropped off water or whatever you're going to do for the cache sites, are you dropping your car at the north end and then trying to get back to the south end, or what did you do to make that work?
Yeah, so I would not recommend what we did, which I'll get to in a minute, but I'd say there's probably 2 options. Either you do it supported, so either somebody to drive you to one end or the other, or you use the shuttle service from Medora. So if you're looking to shuttle to either end of the trail, there is Dakota Cyclery, which is based out of Medora, and they offer a shuttle to each end. You have to do some scheduling with them. It's not a very cheap option. It's about $500 to get It's 250 to get to the south end, 250 to get to the north end, essentially. But they will do some water caching for you if you request them. So if you have a few more funds and you want to help support a local business and you don't want to do some of the other prep work, it's a really good option. We weren't in that boat. So we intended to park at one end and get a ride to the other end and then hike back to our vehicle. So we parked at the north end of the trail at the north unit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park and intended to take an Uber or a Lyft to the southern end. And we'd scheduled one for the day that we got there for 9:30 in the morning. So we get to the park, we get our backpacking permit, we get all of our stuff sorted out, 9:05, 9:10, 9:20, keep checking the app and nothing. Well, at about 9:25, I check the app and I check a little more closely, and there's some very small text that says that there are no drivers available. So that was a little bit of a surprise. In hindsight, I shouldn't have been surprised because it is very much off the beaten path. So my wife and I decided, well, let's just hike it north to south and make that a future Lafe and Faith problem. And while we're doing that, let's stick our thumbs out and see if we can hitchhike. Lo and behold, we had started walking down the road a little bit to get to the trailhead, and a guy pulls over and picks us up, and he says, where are you guys going? I said, Medora. And he's like, perfect, that's where I'm going. And
Perfect.
So he drove us all the way down to Medora, and the southern end of the trail is actually about 20, 30 miles south of Medora, just down a bunch of gravel roads. And as we got towards Medora, we were talking the whole time, and I asked him, so what's your business down in Medora? Like, what are you going to go do down there? And he's like, well, my girlfriend told me that I should go check out Medora while I'm in the area because it's, the prettiest part here. So I was just planning on doing some off-road and driving down some gravel roads. And I said, well, that is just perfect because we need to go down a gravel road near Medora. And he's like, oh, well, perfect. I'll take you right to the trailhead. And yeah, it was nothing short of providential that was arranged for us.
Yeah, that sounds like it worked out perfectly. So despite the lack of an Uber, I guess it's probably better to arrange with a shuttle company or something like that in a more remote area, but I'm glad it worked out for you guys. You mentioned as you were describing your answer that there were permits that were needed. Can you explain what the process is for getting permits for the trail?
Yeah, it is about as simple as could be. So the vast majority of the trail is on the Little Missouri River National Grasslands, and you do not need any permit of any kind to hike through or camp on the national grasslands. However, you do need a permit when you are in the national parks. So if you go to one of the ranger stations at the north or south unit, they will issue you a backcountry permit, and there's no reservation system. You're going to have to pay money and they only issue so many. It's just you walk up, you ask for one, you give them a few details of your trip, and then basically they issue it to you, tell you the rules, and off you go.
So that brings me to the question of how many people are actually out there doing this. And I'm guessing it's not very many doing, especially a through hike. Maybe people are, like you said, more on the southern end doing shorter versions. So tell me about that. Is there anyone else out there, or is this pretty much a place you can have to yourself?
Yeah, so there's not all that many people. So we hiked, 150 miles, and I think we saw probably 30 people, and half of those were in a group of mountain bikers we encountered. So we saw at least one person every day. And the first day, it was just a single day hiker. Then it was a mountain biker. Then it was a backpacker. And we encountered 2 through hikers the entire time. They were southbound. We were northbound. So I don't know how many people hike it south to north because we're in the same flow as them. But otherwise, you do see a handful of people here and there. I wouldn't rely on making this a social outing by any stretch of the imagination, though.
Okay. And so you've mentioned a few times that you're in this national grassland, and we've talked about the Badlands a little bit. For people who haven't been to this part of the country, maybe you could talk a little bit about what this all looks like, because to me, that's the most interesting thing about this trail. The remoteness is interesting, but also this terrain is really unique in the United States, I think. And most people who backpack probably have not backpacked in this kind of terrain. So talk a little bit about what you're hiking through.
Words will never do it justice, so you're going to have to look it up. However, I'll do my best to describe it. It's very hilly, but you have, instead of grass going all the way down the hills, you really only have grass on the top of the hills and way at the bottom. And all the way down the sides is essentially bare dirt. And it's this gray to red to dark shades. of bentonite clay, which is what the whole area is made out of. And you have a lot of layers in it. So as you look out across vistas, you just see these highly stratified hills with a lot of grass on top. And then as they, dip together and, water runs and erodes it, waters a lot of trees. So you get lots of little ravines with forests of junipers. And as those streams collect together into larger streams and rivers, you get cottonwoods and aspens and other varieties of trees. But it's very beautiful. It's kind of hard to describe in the sense of, with mountains, you have big soaring peaks and granite spires and pine forests, whereas it's a very subtle landscape in many ways.
Probably longer vistas, though, in some ways, right? You can probably see when you're on top of those grasslands some pretty far distances.
Yes, you can see very, very far because nothing is all that high around you. So you end up going up and over these buttes and then down into river valleys and then through creek beds, up back onto the buttes and the plateaus.
What about the wildlife? What did you see out there?
We saw a lot of rabbits. We saw a few elk, a few mule deer, and surprisingly enough, a lot of horned toads, or I guess horned lizards / horny toads, the same name, or different names for the same animal. It was funny. So we started hiking, and within the first 5 miles, Faith and I saw 30 of these little toads. And they're not a very common thing to see around the rest of the U.S., and they are adorable. They are just the cutest little lizards. So we took a bet on how many we would see. Faith said somewhere in the 80s, and I said 118, and we kept close track. And by the end, we counted 114 of these little toads. So
wow,
you will see them all over the place.
So you won the intra-family bet.
Yes, I did, or at least was closest.
Also, I saw in looking this trail up that there are bison in the area and maybe some wild horses as well. I don't know if you saw any of that, but that seems like a unique thing that most people don't see on most trails as well.
Yes, that is very good to bring up. So in the national park, you get a lot of bison because they're protected area, and it's an opportunity for those animals to roam in their natural habitat. And as you will see signs for anywhere and everywhere, bison are very dangerous, and you really have to watch out for them. I don't know what it is about them, but they have a tendency to stand right on the trail. Anytime we were in a place that there could be bison, it was like, oh, yep, there's a bison right in front of us. Now we have to go climb up this hillside or walk way out around them to not disturb them. I should also mention the vast majority of the national grasslands is used as cattle grazing lands. So you encounter a lot of cows, and they are scared of you, essentially. They just run away. Even big bulls, they look at you and then they go trotting off at a pretty quick clip, but not bison. They will stand there or just lay there. And yeah, they know they're the king of the roost.
So essentially, you're going to have to go around them at that point.
Yes. Otherwise, I've seen people say that, like on the Maah Trail Association site, they talk about rattlers. We didn't see any rattlesnakes. We didn't encounter them at all. We did see a few other yellow-bellied racer snakes and garter snakes, but didn't encounter rattlesnakes at all. But they're definitely something to be aware of. We heard coyotes every night, which personally I love to hear coyotes. I think it's so cool. But we didn't see any during the day. Otherwise, we saw a couple toads. We did see horses. So there are wild horses in the national parks. We did not. Where we saw them was just out on the national grassland, and we ran into 2 horses and 2 mini horses that were together for whatever reason.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about the itinerary and what this looks like. You've mentioned that it's about 9 days roughly to do this trail. We don't have to go through every day and what you encountered every day, but I guess are there things to be thinking about going south to north? For example, does the terrain change and get harder or easier, or is it pretty much consistent throughout, or river crossings that are more of an issue at one part versus another? Anything you want to highlight as far as challenges or even things to see that are worth noting as you go from south to north?
So the biggest difference with going from south to north versus the other way is you hike more or less along the Little Missouri River, and the Little Missouri River flows north to meet the Missouri River. So you're actually hiking down. You end up being probably like 500 feet lower than when you start. So you do not notice it. There is enough up and down in between. But if that's something that you're looking for to not add any ascent, then hiking it south to north would be a good option. Otherwise, I don't know that there's a good argument for hiking it one way versus the other. You have two primary river crossings. One is at Sully Creek State Park, and the river there is very wide and shallow. And when I say very wide, it's probably like 50 feet wide. I grew up near the Mississippi River, and the mighty Mississippi is quite a river. So when I go out west and I see the Little Missouri River, it is kind of more of a creek in many areas, especially later in the season when there's not as much water. But the other crossing is definitely more difficult to do. As you have traveled north, the river is substantially larger, so you have to wade across, and since it's all bentonite clay in that area, it is so mucky. I have not encountered a river that is more just squelching under your feet, trying to suck your feet and boots into the ground than that river. There is, near the second crossing, about a mile away, you do end up crossing another stream, which is actually the deepest water crossing that we had during the trip. It was very, very narrow, but quite deep. It went up to about our kneecaps. From other people that we talked to on the trail, it's up to thigh deep during some parts of the year. So that one is definitely something you should think about. So as for other water crossings, we didn't have any. We hiked the trail towards the end of August. And although we crossed many stream beds, most of them were dry or were muddy, or if there was any water left, it was standing and you could walk around it if you needed to. That being said, I would strongly recommend bringing water shoes that you can wade through water with and not worry about soaking your boots.
Any sites along the way that maybe aren't directly on the trail that are worth doing a detour to see or anything like that that's notable? Or is it pretty much just stay on the trail and enjoy the scenery and go?
Medora is definitely worth visiting. It's a good place to stop and get a burger or whatever for lunch and maybe resupply a bit. Otherwise, we did not detour off the trail to see anything. The trail does not take a point-to-point route as being straight. It says, I will do this as a ball of yarn, and it goes every which way except straight at every possible opportunity. So you get to see quite a lot just by virtue of walking along the trail.
Is there anything you would do differently if you were to do this trail again? And I know you said you won't do this trail again, but I'm just saying, if you were to advise others on how to do this trail, which is what we're doing here right now, is there anything that you did that you would do differently?
If I were to recommend doing anything differently, I would say setting up a shuttle service or doing the trail assisted would be very wise. Otherwise, I think we did the trail about as best as we could. We got good distance. We didn't overextend ourselves. We did it in about probably the most average weather you could expect for the time of year that we did it in. So it was hot and cloudless and windless some days, and other days it was cloudy and windy and cool. It's just comes with the territory. It's not a very friendly place out there in terms of it does get quite hot. It does get quite cold, but it's very beautiful, and I think it's very much worth it. And it's not any more extreme than you would get in any alpine areas or a desert area by any stretch of the imagination. But it is just like with any hike, you should be prepared to be physically uncomfortable in the weather.
Okay, so now a question I'm curious about. Now that you've done a 150-mile hike, what do you think? Are you going to do something like that again?
So in my blog post, I wrote that we will never do this trail again and that we will never do the PCT, which is part of why we wanted to try through hiking or longer distance hike, I guess. And I think I would still stick with that answer. I don't think I'll do the MDHT again. Not that anyone else shouldn't do it. I would strongly recommend it to many people because it is very beautiful, and I would happily go back to that area and visit again. But I won't hike that far again, probably either on that trail or on another one. I think that it was just a bit further than we were comfortable with. I think after about 7 days, I've pretty much had my limit on the trail. So I will happily do 7-day hikes all over the place. Just 9-10 day ones might be something I refrain from.
Okay. No, that's fair. And it's good to learn what your limits are. And I'll just make one suggestion. Like I said earlier, you might try stringing together a 5-day hike and then taking a full day off, like 2 nights somewhere without moving, whether it's in a town or at a lake or whatever, and then see if you could do another few days and feel differently about it. That's just something you might consider trying.
Yeah.
But I get, it's good to know what you're comfortable with, and it sounds like you learned that on this trail. Is there a particular moment or memory that sticks out for you, or for you and Faith, that she's talked about, or you've talked about together, that will stick with you guys for a long time from this trail?
Probably walking into Medora, just feeling beat and like, we're not going to be able to do this. Like, this sucks. Why are we even here? We're just going to quit. And it was a dreary day to start. It was cool. It was windy and cloudy, and we just hurt all over. And then, we got food, we got ice cream, we got some modern medicine, and I can remember just both of us being like, okay, yeah, we can do this. Like, we're going to do this. Like, we got this.
See what I'm talking about? It's not as bad as
you. Some hot food just really,
right.
really turns around your mood. Yeah.
You could see if you just strung it together like that, with more towns, it might work.
Yes. Yes. That's a good point. We may have to do that in the future then.
All right. Well, Lafe, I really appreciate you telling me about the Maah Trail. But while I've got a few more questions if you're okay with that.
Shoot.
Okay, so what is the next trip on your list? And I'm guessing it's not one that's 150 miles.
No, at least not to my recollection. So this summer, one of the places we visited was Great Basin National Park in eastern Nevada, and I loved it there. I thought it was super beautiful. So the next thing on my list is doing the Ruby Crest Trail in Nevada. So I heard about it from this podcast, and pretty much since I heard about it, I wanted to do it. And now, having visited Nevada, I really want to do it.
Yeah, you should. I had 2 different episodes on it. One that I did when I hadn't done it yet, and then another one that I did an episode after I actually went and did it, with my son and with my friend Tony. And yeah, it's a great trail. It's a fantastic area. I highly recommend it. So I hope you get a chance to do that. And it's not 150 miles. It's something like, I don't know, 40 something miles. It's doable.
Perfect.
Cool. So I hope you do that. Okay. What is the best backpacking or hiking advice that you've gotten?
Cut your toenails. I remember I was hiking in just a little state park near where I lived, and I was just training for the summer pretty much. And this guy said, he'd done random backpacking trips all over the place. And so I was just kind of chatting with him. He's like, you always got to remember to trim your toenails. And I thought about that. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And after I did more hiking, and I started to actually get some toe pain from not cutting my toenails. And so whenever I hike, I am religious about trimming my toenails all the time.
That's good. That's actually good advice. I think my approach on shorter hikes, meaning hikes that are like a week or less, I would cut them like a week before and then like file them a little bit. So they're kind of perfect by the time I'm on the trail. But when I did the Colorado Trail, which is a much longer hike, I had to be cutting them during the hike too.
Right.
Yeah, that is important because foot care can make a huge difference. And it sounds like you guys had some issues with blisters and things like that. So you know that foot care can be important.
Yes, definitely.
All right. What is the dumbest thing you've ever done when you were out hiking?
One of the dumbest things I've ever done was the first time I ever went backpacking with my aunt and uncle. We were on a very steep mountainside. And since I was, a pretty dumb teenager, they put me between them. I was not allowed to be in the front or the back. And my uncle had to pass by me to get something for my aunt's backpack. And instead of stepping to the inside of the trail, I stepped to the outside of the trail. And I can't remember if he bumped me or if I just stepped to make a little more room. And essentially the outside of the trail crumbled and I started sliding down the mountainside. And so I dug in my poles and I dug in my boots as best I could. And fortunately, I only slid a few feet down, and they grabbed me and hauled me back up onto the trail. But that was a pretty terrifying moment. And definitely one of the stupidest things I've ever done.
Was this a pretty serious drop off?
If I had rolled down it, I probably would have broken an arm or two. I wouldn't have died, but it would have been very uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's always a fear when you're hiking, right? Because there's a lot of times when you're exposed on trails and you think, well, I'm never just going to fall off a trail, but it could happen someday. You hear about these random times when people do that. So
right.
Yeah, I worry about that sometimes. Well, I'm glad to hear that it almost happened, but not quite. So that's good.
Yep.
All right. Last question. What is the most valuable thing that backpacking or hiking has taught you?
It's probably cliche, but the endurance that you have just by putting your mind to it is pretty phenomenal. I talked about in this podcast, we're thinking about quitting and, we got a little pep in our step just from some food. But if you really put your mind to getting something done, you could push yourself a lot further than you probably think. As we got towards the end of the trail, there were a couple days where we were getting tired of being on the trail and wanted to crank it out, and we pushed and got a lot more miles done than I really thought we could. And it was just, put your head down, put your mind to it. And we did a lot more than I expected that we would be able to.
Yeah, that's true. We are definitely capable of a lot more than we think we are sometimes. Lafe Wessel, thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Lafe Wessel for coming on the show. And I hope that we've inspired you to hike the Maah Trail. And if you've enjoyed this episode, tell a friend about it, or better yet, give us a good review on whichever podcast service you use. And keep in mind that this podcast is entertainment and meant to spark your interest. If you decide to hike the trail, do your own research. Like anything else worth doing, outdoor adventure has risk. So when you go, pack your common sense. And when you get back, tell me how it went. Let's talk about our next episode. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we go back to the Rockies, but not for a Colorado Rocky Mountain high. This time we go further north, where we'll climb spectacular passes and rugged mountains, and hike through beautiful meadows and past stunning alpine lakes where we'll have relative solitude, hiking and camping in an impressive national park, but not a national park of the United States. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we make our first trip to the Canadian Rockies, where we'll hike the Sawback Trail from Banff to Lake Louise in Banff National Park in Alberta, Canada. To see photos of lots of the hikes that we cover on the show, follow us on Instagram at Trails Worth Hiking Podcast. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode or ideas for future episodes, including if you want to be a guest and talk about a trail that you've hiked, reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. So start planning your next hike, and before you know it, you'll be on the trail. Thanks for listening.